In order to begin the comparative process, the next step is to have you simply write about one work rather than comparing two or more. And so we're going to call this a reflection paper because it's going to be not only analysis but also your reflection. The reflection paper is a short writing of about 500 words, and I divide it into two parts, the part of analysis and the part of reflection. You can position either of these parts first in your paper. I usually like to do the analysis part first. You have to make sure to include some specific things in your analysis, and this is also listed in the grading rubric. Be sure when you're writing your reflection paper to give the name of the work you've chosen, as well as the name of the creator, and do be sure to spell these things correctly. Also include the creator's dates and the date of the work whenever possible. Sometimes you're doing an analysis of a work by an anonymous creator, or you're doing a work that doesn't have a specific date of composition or publication, but you should do a little bit of research and try and narrow that down whenever you can. Then you simply go at it. Analyze this work. You're going to use the structural elements specific to the medium of that work. If you're describing a work of visual art, use the structural elements of visual art that you'll learn in Module 3. If you're describing a piece of music, use the elements of music that you'll learn in Module 2. Likewise, if it's a work of literature, use Module 4's structural elements and describe the work in that way. You can also, of course, include the subject matter of the work, but remember to try and balance your analysis between composition of the work and what it's about. Whenever you're doing the analysis, you should be as specific as you can. Use the terms and refer to specific places on the canvas or places in the literature or specific musical events as specifically as you possibly can. Then you can include in your writing a reflection of the work. I like it when the reflection and analysis are each about 250 words, so they're about equally weighted in the paper, although that's not an absolute requirement. When you describe your own reaction to the work, you could say whether you like it or don't like it, but don't stop there. Go beneath superficial likes and dislikes. You can talk about your own interpretation of the work, even if it's different than the common interpretation of the work by a historian or a specialist. You can certainly include a memory or a train of thought that the work has started in your own mind. Perhaps the work reminds you of some other thing that you've seen or heard. Perhaps it causes you to reflect on your own circumstances or a part of your own life. That's all fair game in the reflection. You have in the components for this module the complete text of a sample reaction paper that's written very carefully, and so it includes some good elements that you should note. Here are just a few excerpts from that reaction paper. This reflection paper is about Canova's sculpture, Cupid and Psyche. This reaction or reflection first starts with analysis, as it should. It describes the sculptor, Canova, including his dates. It tells when he created the work, that is, in the neoclassical period, so that's putting it in its historical context. It also touches on the subject matter by saying that it's about the story of an ancient Greek god, Cupid, and Psyche. Then the writer begins to show the elements of visual art. Again, we haven't yet learned those specific terms, but this writer has taken care to include examples of how that structure in the visual work is accomplished. For example, we have a shape of an X that's made by Cupid's wings and the legs of the characters. The writer goes further to say that the X is really made up of two V shapes that touch at their central points. And so the writer also draws a conclusion about the upper V belonging to the deity, the god, while the lower V belongs to the human portion of this story. The reflection paper goes on to discuss the subject matter of the sculpture itself, and thus has to bring in the storytelling of the myth of Cupid and his love Psyche. So it actually ties together the original historical or mythological context. It ties together the composition of the actual piece and just the subject matter of the work itself. The second half of the reflection paper deals with the writer's own personal reflections and ideas about this particular sculpture. The writer states that she really likes this sculpture, but doesn't stop there. She lists the details of the combination of a mythical subject with natural detail. She goes on to include, again, some structural elements as part of her own reflection, something that seemed important to her or striking, fascinating, interesting, and that was the X formed by the two characters, which was described as a structural element on the first page. These are all parts of the reflection paper that make it indeed a very successful writing. Some specific details about format are mentioned here, but you can also see them in the actual document for you to read with a very clear list of formatting requirements. In this case, there are two things that are worth noting. The opening of the paper has a title, in this case, sample reflection paper. It has the writer's name. It has the name of the work that's being described, and it has the date that it's due or the date that it's being handed in. That's just important from an identification standpoint. At the end of the paper is something that is also just as important. The writer describes a myth of Cupid and Psyche and had to turn to an outside source to confirm that myth. That is, to find out more details about how Cupid and Psyche fell in love and what happened to them. And so she made sure to include the work that she had to check to follow up on that myth. And that's listed at the end of the paper in something called Works Cited. You might see this in other style manuals called a bibliography. Your instructor will let you know if there's any specific style manual that you should use for your citations, whether that's APA, MLA, or Turabian, or others. But it's really very, very important to show where you got the information if the information didn't come from your own analysis. Now, close this movie and go ahead and read in more detail the sample reflection paper on Canova's Cupid and Psyche. Then you'll be ready for the assignment that asks you to critique yet another sample reflection paper, one that is partially successful and partially in need of revision.